That brings us to our next session, ladies and gentlemen. We have presenting the keynote address just after lunch, the president of JERA. Please welcome on stage Mr. Yuji Kakimi-sama.
Okay. Good afternoon to you all. I am Yuji Kakimi, President of JERA. It is a tremendous honor for me to present to you a keynote and to do so for 2 years running. I am also very pleased to be able to speak on my favorite subject because, in my humble opinion, Japan has been one of the earliest innovators in utilizing LNG. Needless to say, I will focus my attention on Asia, the role to be played by LNG in the region, and most importantly, on why innovation matters in order for us to increase usage of LNG even more. Let me begin by reminding us all that baseline of prognosis holds that LNG remain in the great demand long term, especially as you see in Asia. And yet, for such growth to really take shape, there are two preconditions. First, there must be infrastructure build-up on the part of the consumer countries, and second, advancement of the LNG trading market across the region. I must add, however, that innovation is changing the equation in many ways right before our eyes. First, a few words about history. This page shows how much investment in infrastructure you have had to make in order for us to buy and use LNG. The LNG revolution, meaning wider use of gas for summer power, dawned in Japan some 50 years ago. TEPCO and Tube, from which my company JERA came into being, played a pioneering role by first building port terminals, LNG tanks, pipelines, vaporizers plants, power generators using the gas, and power transmission lines. In short, by constructing the initial complex infrastructure. Because this took a considerable amount of money and time, good project management, and the ability to structure syndicated financing were vital. So that's what we have had to do so far. Now, enter innovation, which changing the LNG landscape rather dramatically. Yes, this is a picture of an FSRU. We no longer need costly land-based infrastructure such as LNG tanks, vaporizers, and so on. One floating storage and regasification unit, or FSRU, can perform many functions. Take a look now at power generation. The graph demonstrates that in about 10 years' time, some 70% of burnt gas will be converted into power. We began half a century ago with the efficiency ratio at 40%. Some of our newest plants turn as much as 63.8% of the burnt gas into power. But believe me, we can go much further in a relatively short period of time because we can benefit increasingly from technologies such as AI. That's why I am confident, ladies and gentlemen, that innovation will enable the entire region to use a much larger quantity of energy in a much more efficient way. Let me now turn my focus to the energy market. So far, the market has been segmented into 3 regions, as the picture on the left-hand side shows. The market has been less liquid and less transparent as a result. But now, more Asian countries, such as China and India, have emerged as great energy buyers. On the supply side, the number of players has gone up as well, especially with the entry of US LNG into the market. The market has undergone quite a change from segmentation to integration. This chart sums up that changes that are taking place in Asia. In the near future, that Asian energy market will be more liquid, less related to oil price, traded through short and spot contracts, and with no destination restrictions. These are all welcome developments. Neither solar nor wind power gives us stable provision of electricity. The resultant volatility in supply is being smoothed out by burning energy, which is why we need more liquidity in the energy market. For the same reason, we need to be able to hedge against price volatilities, and we have yet to develop the price benchmark, not to mention forward pricing. Innovation must accelerate market integration in order for more liquidity and price transparency to be obtained. I should mention here that one such innovative development is the greater use of energy bunkering. Now, my company, JERA, is still relatively young, having been established less than 4 years ago. However, it is actually among the world's biggest as regards thermal power generation and fuel procurement, as it came into being by merging those 2 business domains that were previously under the roofs of TEPCO and TUBE. As you can see, JERA procured 40 million tons per annum, which is by far the largest in the world. JERA has 8 energy terminals, and our power generation capacity stands at 70 gigawatts domestically and 8 gigawatts outside of Japan. So obviously, we are endowed with an integrated global value chain, which is why I firmly believe that the company must play an innovative role in many respects. One thing we wish to do is to help those Asian countries with increasing demand for energy and power by providing gas-to-power solutions. JERA Energy Development Asia based in Singapore, will be responsible for providing these solutions. We are also determined to help enrich the Asian energy trading market. We already have considerable experience in trading coal. From next year onward, our trading platform will start dealing in LNG, and will introduce a variety of arrangements such as short-term cash trading and futures trading of LNG. And also in Singapore, JERA Global Markets will be in charge of energy trading and optimization. We at JERA are for energy for a new era. Thank you very much.
Kakimi-sama, thank you very much, sir. Thank you. And now addressing us, ladies and gentlemen, is the Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources, U.S. Department of State. Please welcome on stage His Excellency Frank Fannon.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be able to speak with you here today on a topic of great personal pride, the U.S. energy policy picture over the last 10 years. I'll touch on where we were then, where we are now, and with the energy pillar of the Indo-Pacific Strategy Secretary Pompeo announced in July, where we anticipate we'll be 10 years from now. I'll take a speaker's privilege and go back a few years earlier to 2005. At that time, the U.S. was producing 5 million barrels of oil per day, the lowest rate since 1949. Congress was holding a series of hearings to examine natural gas scarcity, where prices were around $8 per 1,000 cubic feet, and industry was developing LNG import terminals. In response, Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which included a small provision concerning hydraulic fracturing. In a modest paragraph, the Congress set the conditions for what was to come. Congress provided that the federal government would not stand in the way or try to direct industry, but the individual states were better positioned to regulate this new technology. Industry responded and meaningfully launched what we know today as the shale revolution in 2008. By combining hydraulic fracturing with horizontal drilling, U.S. producers were able to exploit previously unrecoverable resources and reverse what had been projected as long-term decline in U.S. production. U.S. companies continued to innovate, improved operational performance, and launched what we now recognize as a true production revolution. Fast forward to today. The United States is now the world's largest oil and natural gas producer and the second largest producer of renewable energy. In this room, we understand that energy is more than simply fuel and technology. Energy underpins all modern development and enterprise. And energy security is foundational to economic security, and indeed, a nation's sovereignty. The United States' energy abundance has been helping the energy security of partners around the world, especially here in the Indo-Pacific. With 2 LNG export facilities now operating and more on the way, the United States is providing secure, reliable, and flexible cargoes that guard against market disruptions. The Indo-Pacific will account for over 60% of energy demand growth by 2040 and roughly 85% of growth in net gas imports, underpinning a shift in trade flows from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The United States is a Pacific nation, just as it is an Atlantic nation. In July, Secretary Pompeo announced a renewed commitment to the development of the Indo-Pacific. Our economic strategy will focus on 3 areas: digital, energy, and infrastructure. We're pursuing the energy pillar through Asia Edge, or enhancing development and growth through energy. The State Department-led Asia Edge will harness a whole-of-government approach to invest resources to help our Indo-Pacific partners to import, produce, and deploy energy resources. We've identified 4 core priorities for EDGE. 1, strengthening the energy security of our allies and partners. 2, creating open, efficient, rules-based, and transparent energy markets. 3, improving fair, free, and reciprocal energy trading relationships. And finally, an expansion of access to affordable, reliable energy. We're already working with like-minded partners and through multilateral fora like ASEAN, APEC, and the East Asia Summit on shared objectives. Some may challenge these principles, yet no single dominant producer or buyer should be able to set the rules for all market participants, because a free market is one with clear and transparent price signals and one without political influence. Free markets enable supply security. U.S. production is helping Indo-Pacific nations improve their security today, but is poised to do much more. Today, the United States has about 30 billion cubic meters of LNG capacity built. Nearly half of the cargoes in this early stage of export have landed in the Indo-Pacific. We have an additional 65 billion cubic meters per annum coming online. U.S. LNG is not only a story about expanding capacity, it's also a story of innovative financing and flexible contract models. The continued growth of U.S. LNG ultimately means greater optionality, improved security, and lower prices. Meanwhile, U.S. producers continue to innovate. In the next 5 to 10 years, we expect to see improved recovery rates, even a doubling in some of our most prolific basins. What this means for the near term is that the United States may double production, double export capacity, and introduce new market innovations. Asia EDGE is well timed to coincide with the tremendous growth and demand for energy in the region. In the United States, capacity is here to support that growth. Asia EDGE is premised on partnership, and U.S. companies are the partners of choice around the world for good reason. American companies have the best technology, the best safety and environmental records, and are transparent operators, and they respect countries' sovereignty. The United States is and will continue to work in the Indo-Pacific to foster legal, regulatory, and market development. We support reforms that will help countries attract high-quality investment based on partnership, not dependence. These are the conditions that catalyze innovation. Innovation enabled the United States to realize its resource abundance, and it's what we want to see here and support in the region. U.S. oil production continues to grow. In the last 10 years, America more than doubled production, and we're on track to produce nearly 11 million barrels per day. If we add natural gas liquids to that, the U.S. is poised to produce well over 16 million barrels per day. Rapidly growing American production increases the choices of supply for Indo-Pacific consumers and reduces prices, even in places where the U.S. is not the ultimate source of supply. Renewable energy, including hydropower, accounts for 18% of U.S. electricity generation, over double its contribution a decade ago. Considerable U.S. technological innovation and efficient production have driven down solar PV costs by 84% and wind turbines by 32%. This has created a more diverse and secure domestic energy supply. And the United States has been providing technical assistance to many Indo-Pacific nations, exploring renewables and confronting grid integration challenges. The United States has gone through tremendous energy transformation in the last decade. Yet, it was not government that dictated that transformation. Rather, policy empowered our private sector. It was a policy to break down obstacles, to catalyze innovation and catalyze investment. The U.S. energy transformation is still going strong, and we hope to share this experience and build upon it with regional partners through Asia EDGE. We live in an era of energy abundance. Working together, we can ensure that all Indo-Pacific nations are able to utilize that energy for growth, development, and security. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We invite you to take your seat right here for the panel discussion. Now we'd like to invite the moderator for this session, ladies and gentlemen. He is Mr. Ashish Sethia, Global Leader, Commodities, Head of Research, Asia Pacific, Bloomberg, New Energy Finance. Completing the panel will be back on stage, Mr. Yuji Kakimi, President of JERA. Didier Holleaux, he is the Executive Vice President of ENGIE. Rajeev Kannan, Executive Officer, Head of Investment Banking Department Asia, SMBC. Tim Holt, CEO, Siemens Power Services. And completing this illustrious panel is Mr. Pang Yi-in, Director General, Investment Operations, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. Now, as they're making their way up, ladies and gentlemen, we hope we have questions from the floor as well. And we hope we do have time for this session for you to be able to pose your questions. So, not to forget, Pigeonhole Live. Ashish, I'm going to hand the floor to you. Enjoy the session.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure being here today with the distinguished panelists. To save time, I won't do introductions. They have been introduced briefly. And I would start off by reminding everybody that in Q4 of 2008, the oil prices globally were touching around $140 per barrel. And around that time, the world was also staring at a global financial crisis and a recession as well. Raising capital for any technology which was new or any business model which was innovative was extremely challenging, to say the least. However, I think as Frank mentioned and Kakimi-san mentioned, technologies like shale oil and gas, renewable energy, LNG have made significant progress over the last decade or so. So what I wanted to begin with as the first part of this conversation was ask the panelists to reflect a little bit about what are the technological, financial, and policy innovations that they think have made the most difference in the last 10 years. So I'd first go to Didier. From your experience being with ENGIE, a major player in the energy sector across Europe and Asia Pacific and other parts of the world, truly, any specific technology and business model innovation that you would want to highlight?
Well, if we look at technology in the past 10 years, it's clear that renewable electricity has gone at an incredible pace towards low prices. And obviously, we think of onshore wind, we think of photovoltaic panels, but also offshore wind is breaking new ground in terms of being competitive. And what we see happening now is renewable gas. The development of biogas in different parts of the world is starting at a price which may make it economic within a decade, which will bring to any system a storable energy that is lacking in a world where wind and solar are dominating. But if we look ahead, there are more technological challenges coming. And two of them I just want to mention. One is mentioned by Fatih Birol this morning, and it's the challenge of the need of energy for cooling, particularly here in Asia. If we take one of the scenarios of the International Energy Agency, for the countries of ASEAN, the need of energy for cooling today is 84 terawatt hours. In 2050, it will be 751 terawatt hours. That means 90 big 1 gigawatt power plants delivering full-time power just for cooling. And if we leave that this way, then there is no way that we can match the 2 degrees or even more, the 1.5 degrees trajectory. So we have to act on cooling, and the answer is district cooling. The second topic I just wanted to mention very shortly is the need of energy for data. The consumption of data center in the world is increasing by 9% every year. And already the consumption of the IT system worldwide is higher than the consumption of energy for air travel. And if we leave this consumption increase again 9% every year, then once again, there is no way we will meet the 2 degrees trajectory. So we need to act on data center efficiency, and that's what a company dedicated to services like ENGIE is able to do. We have a lot of experts in data center, and we can use the waste heat of data center for many different purposes, including cooling, by the way.
So to summarize very briefly, offshore wind, interesting for you in the last 10 years, you seem to say that it's making significant progress, and biogas seems interesting in the last 10 years. And your wish list includes solutions for cooling as well as data centers. I would come to the wish list in the second round of discussion, but let me go to Rajeev now. Any particular financial products or innovation in the financial markets you think in the last 10 years have significantly helped the energy or mobility sector or infrastructure in general?
Yeah, thanks, Ashish. I guess if you look at the energy sector as a whole, I think there was earlier by Kakimi-san and Mr. Fannon mentioning about how LNG from US is actually displacing or changing the whole market. And I think if you look at how US LNG got financed, again, there was a fair bit of innovation coming in where, because traditionally the model for LNG financing was based on long-term offtake agreements with a very traditional source of supply. But now we found that US LNG was being financed with a combination of loan and bonds, and increasingly bonds played quite an important role in terms of providing that long-term capital. And then if you look across the entire value chain, I think there have been a number of different ways to finance the underlying downstream infrastructure, be it the FSRUs or be it the downstream power plants, where historically they were again based on very long-term financing, but increasingly there is more shorter-term financing. But then if you go beyond the gas value chain to the renewable chain, I think, again, we have seen the costs of renewables drop significantly over the number of years, and the finance world has sort of kept up with the changes over a number of years. And I think recent trends of green bond, which has been an important source of funding for the renewable energy sector, has been growing exponentially. 2017, it was about $180 billion, and it's expected by end of 2018, we will have about $250 billion of green bonds issuances, so which is a very large amount when you compare to 5 years back, it was less than $10 billion. So again, I think the finance world needs to keep up with the pace of innovation and changes in the world of the energy sector. But one of the areas we do have always a concern with is these innovations will lead to stranded assets. And first of all, how do we make sure that we don't get stranded from our funding perspective? And secondly, how does government actually support or manage these stranded assets, which will create a significant amount of strain on the economies, particularly emerging economies?
And are there specific policies you would seek from the governments to avoid potential blowout of the stranded asset situation?
Well, I think obviously when you look at what happened in the last 10 years, and then the government policies played a very important role in bringing the renewable sector to where it is now. I think with the significant amount of feed-in tariff which was created, even for example in Japan, where we started off at 40 plus yen, and now it's down significantly. But those policies created the impetus for renewable sector. But at the same time, if you look at it from Indian perspective, for example, again, significant amount of renewable energy has come in the last 5-7 years. But a lot of the thermal assets, which were also built previously, actually have got stranded. Now, again, we have to leave lot of these sort of investments to market players. Then at the end of the day, if government intervenes significantly in terms of supporting some assets, then it will create imbalances. But at the end of the day, I think we have to also take into account the investment which has gone in. And for example, in India, the banks which have funded the thermal power projects are unable to allocate capital to new areas of capital needs. And that's where there is a constraint being created.
Thanks for that. Tim, any specific technology or business model innovation you would want to highlight in the last 10 years?
Yeah, I think the interesting point is my job 10 years ago was head of strategy for our energy business, and to predict actually what are the technologies that are going to matter the next 10 years. And I can tell you I was wrong in many aspects back then. I think the two things that surprised me the most is really how renewables took a large share of the current investment and capacity additions. If we look at, and going back to your point, if we looked at the cost out curves we had back then, both for wind and solar, I think the prices we see today, we predicted at least, in another 10 years. So I think cost out has really accelerated. And also, I don't think anybody predicted 10 years ago the penetration of PV, of solar that we see right now. I think the second aspect is really when I look at information technology and digitization, and it goes throughout the whole value chain, how we design technology nowadays. We have basically cut down the development time of our new gas turbine technology by 50%. So in the past, it took about 8 years to design a new frame of gas turbines. The latest we are doing right now sits in 4 years, so tremendous acceleration on that point. Also what we've seen in manufacturing, a lot of what we call now additive manufacturing or 3D printing. That's ramping up, giving us new possibilities. Even when we look at erection and commissioning of new technology, we're talking now about 4D approaches, how we look at, how we do large projects and squeeze down the erection time. And then you look at operations, how we use data to really improve the operation and get more efficiency and flexibility out of technology. So for me, those are really the two highlights that happened over the last 10 years.
It's interesting you mentioned renewable energy, because that does get talked a lot about these days. Digital, which is being talked about a lot more in the last 2 or 3 years, I would say. But also 3D printing, which I don't think a lot of people appreciate right now, how much impact it would have. So I'm very eager to hear your wish list for the next 10 years. I'll come back to you shortly. Mr. Yi, you're part of AIIB, multilateral financial institutions, have played significant role in the rollout of new technologies like clean energy or solar PV. But what is the innovation you think has happened in the financial sector in the last 10 years? I think Rajeev mentioned infrastructure bonds a fair bit. He talked about stranded assets. Anything else you would want to add on to what you have seen in the last 10 years as innovation in the financial markets to support energy and mobility transitions?
I'd like to add on to what Kannan mentioned. I think what made possible the huge amount of renewable projects that is in the market now must have been the change of the recognition that the need for change to embark on this renewable energy road. And you can see the China and India are good examples of rising from, in the 10 years ago, hardly any gigawatts of renewable energy to exceeding 50 gigawatts to 100 gigawatts plants and so on and so forth. These is the first, I would say, I would attribute such projects, existence of such projects to good leadership in countries that can foresee the future that we need all this renewable energy. And I think this trend will go on, and coming to the tools, then we enable the creation of projects. If Kannan mentioned about feed-in tariffs, There's also PPP schemes that came across in the market to roll out renewable energy. In fact, renewable energy projects has set exemplary standards for PPP, public partnership type of schemes to succeed. And this PPP schemes have gotten the support of the government's commitment, putting their commitment to it, and that matters. And that make these projects so market-friendly. And when they rolled out, if you can see, it has not just made the renewable projects coming into a market for private sector to participate, but also the financiers at the back supporting all this direct financing, becoming more variety of ways. You mentioned about bonds, participants, you have green bonds, you have even funds and mezzanine level, different ways of participating. But if you also notice, we see new group of investors coming in. For example, you can see the insurance company who are seeking more stabilized yield type of returns, also coming into infrastructure, which we all know are long gestation, high risk projects. And how is it possible? Because of all this very good structuring that has emerged in the energy sector. And we hope to see more and more such projects, more and more such tools being used in the market, and that the government, again, has to start the lead, has to take the lead, and the market participant has to follow up.
I will have a follow-on question for you on the yield equity-related platforms in the next segment when I get to the second round of questioning. But to both you and Rajeev, there is a bit of criticism in the renewable energy industry and the financial markets about the fact that some of the cheap projects that are being built in places like China or India or Mexico or Chile are through competitive auctions or tenders, are basically on razor-thin margins, and financial viability of those projects can, go out of the window if things like currencies move significantly. Any reactions from both of you on that?
Well, I think obviously you have to ask the investors who bid at those prices. But again, if I'm a financier of those transactions, I would obviously look at it very carefully whether to see we can get our debt back based on the terms they have probably bid in. But it's true, because probably there is a lot of capital chasing renewable energy sector. I was earlier this morning at a session with institutional investors, and I think one of the things which was quite a key point was they are having significant amount of capital, but there is very few transactions coming out, very few projects coming out. So when there is any kind of bidding processes, they obviously want to use their own platforms or support other platforms to bid for these transactions. So I think once we can create a larger pool of pipelines, then I think the bidding will be a bit more realistic. But till such times, I guess, unfortunately, capital will chase whatever limited transactions there are.
Kaki-san, I would go over to you and probably ask you the last question and then segment before I move on to the next 10 years. You talked briefly about destination clauses in LNG, but which is probably a commercial innovation going on in that industry. But from a policy perspective, what do you think have been the most supportive or innovative policies in the last 10 years?
And I speak in Japanese.
With regard to innovation in policy, in the presentation, I didn't mention about that. However, I think there are many, especially in terms of LNG. But the key point in the policy is that the gas and oils, they are not a normal commodity. It's a political and a strategic commodity. So because of that, actually, in the US, oil and gas, their policy was not to export oil and gas. However, because of the shale gas revolution, the policy has changed drastically in the US. So they are now willing to export oil and gas. So in the LNG world, that gave the huge impact in the LNG world.
So Frank, let me move on to the next part of the conversation, opening with you. You talked about the change in the U.S. policy which happened with the Congress bringing in new legislation, and that hopefully helping the shale gas revolution in the U.S. You talked about partnerships with the Indo-Pacific region and the Asia Edge policy. What do you want to see from a policy perspective in the next 10 years, either in the U.S. or in your partner countries around this region?
Yeah, thank you. Where I think we are, as I mentioned, U.S. production profile continues. The industry is not staying where it is. It's not a matter of status quo. It's constant innovation, constant improvements in efficiency, operational performance, getting more out of the same well. I think you've also seen a greater degree of discipline in how those operations are financed. When there was a dip in prices, there's a change from to have more kind of a value proposition. But globally, I think reflecting back to the 2005 energy bill, which kind of set the stages. What that really was a setting the conditions of an enabling environment to allow for innovation and allow for investment to occur. And I think we have a great opportunity in the rest of the world to support what are the enabling environments that allow for the efficient evolution of markets. I know the discussions of Asia hubs and changes in pricing, more flexible contracts, taking away destination clauses. Those are really the first step. And I think particularly the US, but as we see increases volumes, it'll force some disruption in what those markets. And I think it will enable certainly greater efficiency of trading, and which will benefit all in terms of lower prices.
A quick follow-on question. You mentioned pricing signals in Asia. Singapore has obviously done a lot of work with the Singapore LNG index on that. There's Japan-Korea marker. The Shanghai Exchange is trying to build a price signal for Northeast Asia as well. Would you prefer having one signal for Asia, or do you think more the merrier?
We don't particularly have a preference. What our position is to support partners everywhere and support the kind of the framework, which is free, fair, open, transparent signals. The location of that is not particularly the issue. It's what are the conditions? Are we allowed to have free and equitable trading, have clarity of price signals, and take away any opportunity for political influence and kind of coercion and market gaming? That would be our big concern.
Fair enough. Didier, going back to you, next 10 years, you mentioned a couple of technologies you think are very interesting. What else is on your mind in terms of technology?
Well, in terms of technology, as I said, we see offshore wind, and particularly floating offshore wind, because the areas where you have a shallow continental shelf are limited. So we will have to go for floating wind in many parts of the world. And we need clearly to decrease the cost of this technology to make it competitive. We think it will come. I mentioned renewable gas. We see it coming in Europe. We see a potential here in Asia, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, potentially with agricultural waste. You can produce biogas, which could be competitive, and in any case, which will avoid spontaneous methane emissions. Still in terms of technology, I did mention cooling, and it's one of our big concerns because it's completely out of control today. if we leave it to develop as it will spontaneously develop, then it will be individual air conditioner everywhere, which is highly inefficient and which will lead to a consumption of electricity which is not affordable. So these are some of the few technologies that we see as highly critical. And energy efficiency, be it in cooling, be it in data center, be it in average appliance at home or in the industry, is still something that we need to develop. It was underlined this morning by Fatih Birol. The effort in energy efficiency has been insufficient in the past years. We need to improve it. We see a great interest in the industry for improving it, but we need some incentives from the government to accelerate this move, because the best energy is the one that nobody will consume because we have made energy efficiency progress. And today, the effort is insufficient. Companies like ENGIE have all the skills to improve energy efficiency with our customers, and we are delivering this kind of services here in Singapore, but more has to be done in that respect.
Thanks for that. Tim, your technology wish list in the next 10 years?
I think certainly storage will play a big role. We talked about renewables. Most of that is intermittent, so that will drive the question, how do we store some of that energy? I think last year there were about 5 gigawatt hours of storage installed. Prediction is that this will go up to 300 gigawatt hours in the next 10 years. So huge drive. I don't think the technology and the cost is there yet. But I also predict we will see the same that we have seen with other technologies. Once it's there, it's, of course, everybody wants it, which will put a lot of pressure on supply chain, and prices will go up. We'll go through that usual rush. Everybody wants to build it. I also believe we need to upgrade the transmission. So I think a lot of technology will also be on the transmission. We see it in certain countries where offshore wind in Germany is in the north, the need is in the south. So how do you get the energy across the country? So that's certainly one. And then I think the last one that we kind of forget is we still have a huge installed base globally. It's coal, it's gas, everything. And how do we make that installed base more efficient? So I believe also, if we want to meet the climate goals, we have to go back to the installed fleet and see what we can do in upgrades, less emissions, more efficiency, and so on, and really work on that big installed base that's out there across the globe.
So I'm glad you mentioned both storage and taking care of the installed base and the emissions from that, because I was about to put you guys on spot for that. Oof. However, I'll put you guys on spot on another technology. None of you has talked about hydrogen in any detail. And it does get mentioned a lot. Any thoughts on that?
Well, we clearly believe that hydrogen and renewable hydrogen will come and will have a major role to play in order to be able to store electricity in a massive way. Because you cannot store electricity in batteries for any length of time. You can store it for intraday, possibly intra-week storage, but as soon as you come to seasonal storage or facing a fortnight of low wind and no sun, then battery is impossible because you would need huge quantities of battery. There is a comparison that I do like to use. The storage capacity of the gas system in France alone is 135 terawatt hours. A Tesla battery is 13.5, the power wall is 13.5 kilowatt hours. So you just need 10 billions of them to store as much energy as you have in the energy storage or in the gas storage of France alone. So the only way to store energy at a large scale is in the form of gas. And naturally, if you have power, the easiest gas you can produce is hydrogen. So hydrogen will come as a necessity for massive storage of energy. And then once you have hydrogen, mobility through hydrogen is a good solution for heavy trucks. It's a good solution even for individual cars if you need to drive any length of kilometers or miles. So once hydrogen is there for energy storage, it will be used for many other things. But there is a necessity for hydrogen for storage.
So batteries for short-term storage, hydrogen and gas for seasonal, longer-term storage. Yep. Fantastic. Again, going back to the bankers for a few minutes, your wish list for the next 10 years, what products or instruments you want to see grow significantly in the next 10 years to help an energy transition?
Well, I think firstly we need to think about that a significant percentage of the population in this part of the world still does not have access to power, right? So I think what we need to talk about is, can we build the gas infrastructure, downstream infrastructure to get them basic power? And obviously renewable can play a role, but still renewable cost is it's a bit higher compared to, except for certain markets, compared to other forms of power generation. So I think some policy which allows the development of gas infrastructure, which some people talk about it as a bridging fuel, but it could actually be a fuel which sort of bridges for a slightly longer period of time than just 5 to 10 years. But the second part of it is, I think, relating to, again, the whole carbon capture and sequestration. I think obviously we haven't talked much about that, but at the end of the day, that is still a technology or a process which people need to invest in and sort of help reduce the carbon emissions, and which would be one way for government to support the industry also.
Mr. E, anything from you? Next 10 years, what do you want to see in the financial markets to support the energy sector?
So in AIIB, we are committed to support our member countries in enabling their citizens to get access to energy resources, and we are also committed to help them migrate to a lower carbon regime. On the former, as what Kannan mentioned, we have to think about, for example, in ASEAN, 60 million people still do not have electricity access. 60 million, that's a big number. That's more than 10 times Singapore's population. Okay, so how do we going to have a new paradigm to enable distributed generation, to enable transmission lines to happen? We need all this thing to happen. It's not so much of technology innovation. Oh yeah, it has technology innovation, but a lot of it has to do with, again, go back to the my earlier point, policy innovation being a primary part of innovation. Policy innovation must come forward first. But there's a new dimension here now, which is the regional cooperation. So now, why there's 60 million, for example, in ASEAN that has no electricity access, there are good reasons for it, and therefore the regional cooperation need to come in to resolve all these problems. And it is an opportunity for companies, it's an opportunity for countries that is lending a helping hand, and that could be a market of its own. On the latter part, that means on the going to a lower carbon footprint, carbon credits and other micro policies, even allowing solar cars to go on the roads and so on and so forth. These are policies that countries must look into in order for us to really move ahead in energy, next stage of energy sustainability. Thanks.
I'm glad you mentioned carbon credits, because in the session pre-lunch, I think there was a statement being made that the world needs a carbon price signal.
Yes, yeah.
And again, you know, for 40 minutes we kept on having a discussion on innovation, but we didn't talk about that.
It's a big topic.
Thanks for mentioning that. Rajeev, one quick follow-on question from to you. You talked about infrastructure bond, green bonds. I didn't hear anything on yieldcos, infrastructure investment trusts, InvITs, or yield equity platforms. Do you think they'll work in Asia?
Well, I think infrastructure, we are talking about more the forms of equity coming in. I think there is obviously a number of plays on platforms being created, and the renewable energy platform is a good example where I think everyone is aware of Equus being bought by GIP at a significant price. And so we are increasingly seeing a lot of platforms. Typically, most of them are country-specific platforms, but they are also regional platforms like Vina Energy or Equus in the past. So we do see such sort of platforms being the source of more capital coming in. And I think, as I was mentioning, I was sitting with a bunch of institutional investors this morning, and they highlighted that they need to deploy $200, $300, $500 million of capital. And the only way you can deploy it is by investing into the platforms, whether it is through trusts or through regional sort of equity platforms. And I think we do see that will be the best way to attract capital.
Sure. Thanks for that. I think there are some questions from the audience which I've already raised, but I think Kakimi-san to you and Frank to you. I'll probably post the last question on the session. And that question is, the energy landscape is changing very quickly, and there are new technologies and financial innovation coming in. What's your advice to policymakers?
Sorry, what was the...
What's your advice to policymakers to keep up with the change in technology and change in financial markets?
Yeah, I would suggest to allow for flexibility. Policy, not every country in the world is geologically blessed with resources. But there's no restriction on the ability to send those resources and send the technology and to allow for all to share in the resource abundance, whether that's technological or hydrocarbon based. And so I would suggest that to government, to be policymakers everywhere, to be open, to embrace the opportunity to share rather than adopt kind of more restrictive policies. And I think that speaks to some of the broader challenges, the challenge about access to energy and 60 million people. I mean, we should be able to solve that by being more open and creating greater integration of both markets and systems. So I think we really have the opportunity as ours, and I would just encourage policymakers to be open to these opportunities.
Kakimi-san, last word to you. What's your wish list for policymakers? What do you want them to do to keep up with all the innovation happening in technology and finance?
I think there are various requests, but the highest request is that for the breakthrough of long-term innovation, government have to support it. And what I pay attention is that Japanese government is also supporting, but and photosynthesis, it's in Japan, in English. So artificial photosynthesis. So this technology is very interesting, and I'm paying attention to it because the discussion before is that the CO2 is a villain. It's a bad thing. CO2 is a bad thing. That's why we have to reduce and capture. So all the discussion was based on this assumption. However, this artificial photosynthesis, CO2 is a resource. So using the CO2 and create oxygen and others, that's the technologies. So pursuing such technology is very important. So it will lead to the fundamental solutions. So long-term, this will be a long-term breakthrough. So the government have to support such new technology.
Thank you, Kakimi-san, for that. I'll say two final things. One is none of us talked about the trade war and whether we need to have one or not. But that's a discussion perhaps for another day. And I would end by saying that actually there's a comment on the voting system saying this was a pretty useful and interesting post-lunch session, and everybody seems to be awake in the audience. So thank you all for the effort on that. And let's join them in giving them a round of applause to the panelists.